this sort of brings me back around to my theme, because I encountered DMT, LSD, all of these things in that very period when I was getting set to take flight as a Jungian analyst. And what completely blew my mind about DMT, and I mention it again, here's an opportunity for research, is how here's a heretical construction, how trans-archetypal the content of the flash seemed. I was appalled because not only had I a certain amount of interest in Jung and proclivity along those lines, but my original major had been art history. Art historians, what we're trained to do is to be able to look at a motif and say, oh yes, I'm familiar with this from ceramic from second millennia Peru, and also Mandaean embroidery work. We know motifs. We're trained to recognize and connect disparate aesthetic domains. Well, when I smoked DMT and came down, I said, this is not on the map. I can't believe it. That this doesn't connect up to anything. How can there be domains of the human mind that do not announce themselves in folklore, fairy tales, dreams, or mandala painting, that are so removed from the ven of what is human that they are apparently not accessible in structuring our maps of ourself and our psyche? And that for me was the contact with what I call, and I didn't call it this, Rudolf Otto called it this, and this term influenced Jung, Otto preceded Jung, it is the wholly other. And if there is an archetype of the wholly other, then this is it. But perhaps the wholly other transcends the archetypes. This may explain to some degree Jung's interest in Gnosticism, especially the Valentinian school of Gnosticism, which holds, that there is a higher and hidden Father, all God, who is outside the machinery of cosmic fate. And it seemed to me that in those extremely profound DMT flashes, I was actually witnessing a domain outside the machinery of the archetypes, which is, for us as moderns, that's what the machinery of fate is. It's not zodiacal machinery. It's hardwiring in our psychology and our genes that gives us our fate. Well, so having said that, I've not only made the survey, but also brought us to, by ending with DMT, the subject matter of this quest. And I want to make it clear, I speak about the power of the psychedelic experience because I think people should be informed of their birthright. And I feel very antsy around the notion that someone might go from birth to the grave without ever having a psychedelic experience. It makes me as antsy as the notion that somebody might go from birth to the grave without having a sexual experience. It's a strange kind of protective denial, or a kind of expression of fear. This is our birthright. This is part of what it means to be human. These altered states of consciousness, I think, are pretty much scripted into the existence of women because most of them will give birth, which is an organically scripted psychedelic experience from which there is no escape, unless, of course, you go for the drug knockout, the spinal, and then you miss everything. But biologically, physiologically, women are set up for this experience. Men are not. It's possible to build such barriers against overwhelmment that it never happens in your whole life. And I believe that if we psychologically analyze the effects of these psychedelics, what they do is they dissolve boundaries. That's all. I mean, if you interview 10,000 people who've had a psychedelic trip, each one has their own hierophany, their own hieroskamos that unfolded for them. But the sum total of it is boundaries dissolve. And then whatever's on the other side of your boundary comes flooding in to claim you and to reshape and remake your psyche. Well, I see the entire illness of our civilization as an ego inflationary illness. We have gone so sick with ego that we are literally murdering the planet rather than confronting the consequences of our psychic imbalance. And the psychedelics act to redress this. They are almost an inoculation against the ego. And I see the ego as a phenomenon arising in historical time, or rather, actually, history is caused by the ego. But the ego is a component of the psyche that arose in the post-archaic phase, in the post-psychedelic phase. It's entirely a modern invention. It's less than 15,000 years old. And the assumptions of the ego are the source of our neurosis, our disequilibrium. Why did the ego arise? It arose because of the climatologically enforced abandonment of these psychedelic religions of the archaic period. In other words, here is the scenario as I see it. Primates, even primitive, even non-advanced primates like squirrel monkeys, howler monkeys, these kinds of primates, all have male dominance hierarchies. The whole thing with primates is about male dominance. But a lot of things about human beings mark us as the most unique member of the primate group. Obviously, we look different from any other monkeys. Even the stranger monkeys look more like the normal monkeys than we look like them, or they look like us. Our upright posture. The other thing about us is our suppressed estrus cycle. We cannot tell at a glance whether a woman is in heat or not. And yet, obviously, that had a tremendous shaping force on the social psychology of the primates. I believe that everything about us that is noble and worth saving occurs against the grain. That if we had followed the grain, we would still be competing with jackals for the carcasses left by lions of large game kills on the plains of Africa. But when the African continent began to dry up and we were forced out of the trees where we had an arboreal vegetarian lifestyle, we came under great pressure to expand our diet. And I believe that the great unstudied factor in human evolution and human emergence is the effect of a complex diet on our emerging species. And it's not only the presence of hallucinogens such as psilocybin in the diet, but other things as well. Psilocybin is the most spectacular case, and if you came to see Darwin, you'd have to hear about evolution. So you came to see me, so you have to hear this little theory about human emergence. Most of you can probably recite it by heart now. But it's a three-step feedback loop from a fairly bright monkey to a fairly stupid human being. And the way it works like this: these monkeys come down out of the trees. They're predating on kills of ungulate mammals made by lions. They're competing with jackals. They're testing all the foods in the environment, and lo and behold, in the manure of these ungulate mammals that are irradiating across the African continent, there are what are called coprophytic mushrooms. And the presence of large amounts of tryptophan in manure as a substrate means that these coprophytic mushrooms elaborate psilocybin. So here in this new grassland environment are the psilocybin mushrooms. Well, these proto-hominid creatures testing foods for their diet would reach the psilocybin and would test it. Well, then this three-part feedback loop to humanness then comes into play. And it works like this. Very, very light doses of psilocybin, so light that you cannot an hour and a half or 2 hours later tell you've taken anything. You say, I don't feel it. I feel completely normal. I must not have taken enough. That dose, if you would submit yourself to being tested by an optometric apparatus, we could show you that your vision has improved slightly. This is an effect of eating small amounts of psychoactive amines, increase of visual acuity. Well, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that if you're a hunting animal competing in a highly competitive environment and suddenly somebody hands you a pair of chemical binoculars, you are going to be a more successful hunter than other members of your species who are not availing themselves of this food item. So there was reinforcement there. Aha, if we eat these mushrooms in small amounts, we will be more successful hunters. Or maybe it was never raised to consciousness as an if-then relationship. It was just, we eat mushrooms, we hunt well, kind of thing. Then, if you eat slightly more of the psilocybin, if you bring slightly more of it into your diet, it's what's called a CNS stimulator, central nervous system stimulant. An effect of all CNS stimulants is what's called arousal. And arousal means simply that you can't sit still, you're very restless, you're very energetic, and often in the male animal you have an erection. It's an overall systemic arousal. And if you witness this situation in monkeys are very hang loose kind of characters, and so then they just all fall together in a heap and make love. And this increases what anthropologists and primatologists like to call successful instances of copulation. This means that this increased interest in sex, in combination with an increased success in obtaining food, is creating the perfect situation in which there will be a population boom of these creatures. They're eating better, they're enjoying themselves more, and they have better relationships with each other. So population boom is on the way. Well, then, the next and final level is when you raise the dose higher, so you're no longer restless or interested in sex or any of that, but you're flattened with the ecstatic unfolding of the full numinous hallucinogenic rupture of plane, then, and this occurs in the tribal context, then there is boundary dissolution, group sexual activity, and group bonding and identification. And this is where this telepathic coherence, this inner dynamic of cohesion and caring that we see in primitive people to some small degree, and that we imagine must once have been our birthright, this is where it came to be. And at those higher levels of psilocybin, most of you probably know, language is formed by an organ on one side of the brain called Broca's area. Broca's area, the brain being always symmetrically constructed, Broca's area has a twin on the opposite side of the brain, but no one knows what's going on there. It's apparently a silent area of the brain. Well, when you take psilocybin, there is spontaneous linguistic activity, glossolalia. Henry Munn has written about this in his essay, The Mushrooms of Language. It's almost as though psilocybin is a pheromone that promotes linguistic activity, an effort to take verbal intentionality and connect it up to the ontos of being in some way. And then it's almost as though words are born out of you. You give birth to words. And these concrescences of meaning then create a kind of unitary ambiance, which we call understanding. Language is a miracle. I mean, make no mistake about it. I don't think any amount of dissection of monkeys or human cadavers will give you any insight into language. Language is a behavior of some sort, so bizarre, so many orders of magnitude more complex than anything else we do, that for all practical purposes, this is the thumbprint of God upon creation, human language. And it's a self-transforming thing. It keeps bootstrapping itself to higher and higher levels, and it creates for us the entire ambiance of reality. Once we had words, we quickly replaced reality with them. And so I believe that what psilocybin promotes is cognitive activity, the coordination of visual input with plans and strategies for hunting or acquisition or whatever. It promotes this increased arousal, which really, in a way, this arousal is nothing more than a reclaiming of your animal body. You feel restless. You feel your muscles. You feel your genitals. You feel your place in space and time. You are reclaiming your body. And then finally, it inducts you into this domain of the logos, a religious hierophany, something that we as moderns are absolutely as in awe of as our mushroom-munching ancestors 25,000 years ago. We can't reduce it. We don't know what it is. You know, Jung was always so concerned that people say it's only psychological. It's only the psyche. I've got news for you. It may only be the psyche, but the psyche is all there is. And as we came into a relationship with the mushroom, humanness emerged on the African veldt and was able to stabilize itself for a few millennia. And then we fell into history because of climatological change for many reasons. But we literally fell into history. And now we operate in this lower domain, a domain of limitation, of misunderstanding, of low-grade languages. And we are neurotic. We are unhappy. We are dysfunctional. And I believe this is because our connection to the logos, to the informing voice that gives meaning to being, has been broken. Over 10,000 years, it's fallen away. And all we're left with is our spiritual yearnings, our nostalgia for paradise, and our pathologies. And miraculously, we are left with the time capsule of preservation represented by the rainforest shamanic cultures that use hallucinogens. There lies our answer, but it's like the Ouroboros serpent taking its tail in its mouth. The salvation of the super future of the planet lies in a recovery of the values, modalities, and religious practices of 25 to 50,000 years ago. Break, break, break.